Memorial Day weekend, Sunday. I've made it a habit for some time to talk specifically about Memorial Day, and it's a deep spiritual call and meaning for all of us. I want to be clear that we are honoring veterans who have passed, and we particularly think of those who died in war, but it is not limited to that. And this day is a day to remember those who have served and died in the branches of the military and what that means for us as people of faith. We're continuing to include this in our May Mental Health Awareness Month, where we've been talking about monotony and boredom and frustration and fatigue, things that we can easily hide from others sometimes, but never from ourselves. So that's why mental health is always starting with self-awareness, so that we don't fool ourselves into thinking that we can live above human frustration and fear and fatigue. It happens. On this Memorial Day, yes, we first think of the vets who have lost their lives and the sacrifice that they made. And that came in so many different ways, and it crushed so many families. And at the same time, our veterans are fondly remembered who died in war for their sacrifice and their gifts of sacrifice. And so let us remember them and the families that remember them. But let's not stop there, because I think it's in the interest of everyone, including our veterans, past and present, for us to remember what this means in the broader picture. We have, since the beginning of observing Memorial Day for a little over a century, it's between 500 and 700 or 800,000 people that we're talking about whose lives have been lost in war. But again, we're not limiting it to that. And I also want to say that I think it's important for us to note that we don't take the same time to commemorate civilians' lives lost in war, which I think is very important. And I think many veterans who gave their life would think so too. So let us not forget that war is never limited to the killing of soldiers in uniform, ever. And so while we remember them and their sacrifices, it can't stop there with the sacrifices, other sacrifices that were paid as well. I want to bring into this, therefore, in Mental Health Awareness Week, the endemic of suicide among our veterans. Reading from this research that I have here, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 plus veterans have taken their lives after serving and then being in the United States. And in fact, in 2012, we had 177 active duty service members take their life by suicide, take their life, and which is one more, 176 of active duty people that were killed in combat that year. So that data there from 2012 alone tells us how significant this is. And more than that, we've heard about this in the news, and we've read about it, and we've talked about it, and the veterans around us know it as well. That mental health for our veterans is extremely important, and especially when we see that these numbers are stabilizing. That's good that they're not going up, but the numbers need to be going down, but they have not in some 10 years, that our vets are still struggling with such great emotional and mental distress that taking their lives is still all too common. And it is a sacrifice too. It is a death that came through and by warfare experiences that are extremely traumatic. And so we have this opportunity right now, so let's not miss it, to address things like that: suicide among our vets, mental health awareness and health care for our active duty servicemen and women, but also to ask the question at this time every year how we do conflict resolution, how we do conflict resolution as a church, how we do it as a society, as individuals, as a nation, and even reflecting on church history, how the church has resolved or not resolved conflicts well in the past. And finally, of course, how we think as we reflect upon how Jesus commented on and approached conflict resolution. So with that, what about Jesus? Well, Jesus was to be, in many ways, as you know, a kingdom disruptor. Of a different sort, though. Not like Alexander the Great or these others. As we know, he was supposed to be a kingdom disruptor, a ruling disruptor, but one who did it with compassion and kindness, empathy, and favor for the poor and destitute, and doing so by ruling in peace. That's clear, I think, in most of the gospel material we have. But at the same time, it's even more clear that this is not what happened. Jesus was not successful in that. Not in any sense of blaming him, but because the persons on the other side were uninterested in this approach. And peaceful conflict resolution takes more than one. So we see that the way the conflict was resolved in Jesus' time, in spite of him introducing empathy and compassion and understanding as we try to resolve our conflicts with each other, he was instead martyred in the process. And so the story of his attempts to bring peace are somewhat conflicting in the Gospels too, because it's not clear to them how to wrestle with this and iron it out. And the passage that I have for you is actually not the passage that was read. I'm going to do that in the second half of the sermon, talk about both Isaiah and the passage in Mark that Lenita read. But I want to get us there first by touching on this text before the break here. And that is this place where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all deal with this conflict resolution story par excellence, if you will, where they come to arrest Jesus. And you know the story well. We've just talked about it during the Passion. And those around him are variously armed with swords. It's part of previous conversations. And they come to arrest Jesus, and something happens, and each of the four gospel writers tell it slightly differently, but it's a slight transition that's significant too. And when we look at it closely, it shows them really wrestling and struggling with this whole thing about conflict resolution and how it should come about. So Mark, one of those who was with Jesus, grabbed his sword and he drew it out and he struck off the high priest's slave's ear. Gospel of Mark, the first gospel written. No one, Jesus included, rebukes this action. Later gospel writers are going to, but in Mark's gospel, they defend Jesus with a sword. They apparently try to take the head off of the high priest's servant or slave who is coming to arrest Jesus, miss and chop off his ear, and the story goes on. Matthew gets a hold of this story about a decade later and does this with it. He says, Jesus says to the person who takes a swipe at the slave's ear, and he says, put your sword back in its place, for everyone who uses the sword will die by the sword. There's Jesus taking a step back from Mark with that and showing that, in fact, clearly this is not the way to go. And he rebukes them to their face. Luke takes it a step further. Luke says that Jesus says, quote, "Enough of this. Enough of this." And he touches the man's ear and he heals him. This is reconciling justice that is further than Matthew takes it. Mark has nothing to do with it. They defended Jesus. It seemed indefensible. Matthew says, no, violence will only bring violence. Luke goes a step further and says, not only will violence bring violence, but follow my practice in the obligation of healing, of reaching out to one's enemies. And then finally, John. Watch his little twist. Finally, it said about Jesus's goal for conflict resolution. John says to Peter, who becomes the individual who swings the sword in John's gospel, "Peter, put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that God has given me?" Now, this is different. John's solution is not Matthew's, it's not Luke's, and it's not Mark's. And this is not frequently noticed. John adds something which is the solution is my own death. Jesus doesn't heal in John. Jesus doesn't tell them that they will die by the sword, but Jesus rather says, I am the one that must die. It will be my martyrdom. It will be my unjust death and murder that will bring peace. We're going to come back and talk more about martyrdom, warfare, and reconciliation when we come back. Okay, Sean, I don't know if you could hear Vanya crying in the background on that. If you can, maybe let me know. I'll try to listen to it before. You'll probably get this in completion before I'll be able to watch it, maybe. I don't know. Okay, part 2. Actually, I'm going to stop so it's a smaller piece.